Picture this. You are Eliza, a wisp of a girl, barely 8 years old, standing on a cobbled street in the grimy heart of industrial London in the year 1870. The air bites with the chill of a late autumn morning, carrying the acrid scent of coal smoke and the distant clang of factory machinery. Your small hand, chapped and red from the cold, clutches a threadbare rag doll, a gift from your mother, now gone. Your father, his shoulders slumped beneath a coat too thin for the weather, avoids your gaze. His face, usually etched with a weary kindness, is now a mask of defeat. He told you this morning that you're going to a home, a place where you'll be fed and kept warm, just until he finds work. He speaks of it with a forced cheerfulness that doesn't quite reach his eyes, which are red-rimmed and swollen from a night spent in silent despair. But what your father hasn't told you is that he signed papers yesterday, papers that surrender you, his youngest, to the mercy of the parish. Papers that give strangers complete control over your life for the foreseeable future. What he hasn't told you is that this home is a workhouse, a place designed not for comfort, but for punishment. A place where the poor are broken, not built up. You don't know that the kind-faced matron who greeted you at the gate, her smile thin and brittle, has perfected techniques for stripping children of their spirit, refined over decades of practice. You don't know that children who enter the workhouse rarely leave, and those who do are never truly the same. By tomorrow night, the girl who loved chasing pigeons in the square and dreaming of a warm loaf of bread will be gone forever. In her place will be something hollow and compliant, something that exists only to pick oakum until her fingers bleed and beg forgiveness for the sin of being born poor. This was the fate of hundreds of thousands of children across Victorian Britain. Young lives disappeared into a network of institutions that promised relief but delivered systematic cruelty, disguised as moral correction. Tonight, we follow Eliza's descent into this man-made hell. A journey that reveals how societal indifference and institutional power can become the most dangerous predators of all. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. The Victorian era, often romanticized as a period of grand innovation and imperial might, harbored a dark secret at its heart: the systematic dehumanization of its poorest citizens, particularly children, within the confines of the workhouse system. This analysis delves into the grim reality of Victorian workhouses, focusing on the experiences of children. From the mid-19th century onwards, these institutions became the primary, and often only, recourse for the destitute. However, far from being havens of charity, they were deliberately designed to be punitive, embodying the harsh philosophy of the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act. This legislation, driven by a fear of pauperism and a belief in individual moral failing, sought to make life inside the workhouse so unpleasant, less eligible than the worst conditions outside, that only the truly desperate would seek its aid. They aimed to uncover hidden truths that challenged conventional historical narratives, providing a deeper, often uncomfortable look into the past. The story of Victorian workhouses, with its stark contrast between public perception and brutal reality, fits perfectly within this framework. Between 1834 and the early 20th century, hundreds of thousands of children passed through the doors of these institutions. At any given time, children constituted a significant portion, often over a third, of the workhouse population. They were not merely residents. They were a source of cheap labor, their innocence systematically exploited to maintain the system and, in some cases, generate profit for the parish. This report will meticulously detail the daily horrors, the psychological torment, and the societal complicity that allowed such a system to flourish, ensuring that Eliza's story, and the stories of countless others, are remembered. Eliza's journey to the workhouse was short, yet it felt like an endless procession through a landscape of deepening despair. Her father, usually so strong, seemed to shrink with each step, his hand, once a comforting anchor, now clammy and hesitant in hers. The familiar sounds of the street, the hawkers' cries, the rumble of carts, the distant laughter of children, faded into a muffled hum as they approached the imposing structure. The workhouse loomed, a grim fortress of red brick and high, unadorned windows, its very architecture designed to intimidate. It was unlike any building Eliza had ever seen, devoid of the intricate carvings of the churches or the welcoming glow of the baker's shop. Its walls seemed to absorb the light, casting a perpetual shadow over the street. A heavy, iron-studded door, flanked by two small barred windows, served as the entrance. Above it, a stark sign, painted in faded black letters, declared, "St. Jude's Parish Workhouse." The name, meant to evoke a sense of charity and divine protection, felt like a cruel mockery. As the heavy door creaked open, revealing a cavernous, dimly lit hallway, the air inside was thick with the smell of carbolic, soap, stale food, and something else. A faint, metallic tang that Eliza would later recognize as the scent of fear. A stern-faced porter, his uniform stiff and unyielding, motioned them inside without a word. The silence within was profound, broken only by the echo of their footsteps and the distant, rhythmic thud of something heavy. Eliza's father spoke in hushed tones with a matron, a woman whose starched white cap and severe expression seemed to drain all warmth from the room. Her voice, when she finally addressed Eliza, was thin and reedy, like dry leaves rustling. "And this is the new arrival, is it?" Another mouth to feed, another soul to save. Her eyes, cold and assessing, swept over Eliza, lingering on her rag doll. The first act of systematic dehumanization began almost immediately. "No personal effects, child," the matron declared, her voice devoid of emotion. "You are now property of the parish. All earthly attachments must be shed." Eliza's small, precious rag doll, her last tangible link to her mother and the life she knew, was gently but firmly taken from her grasp. She watched, tears welling, as it was tossed unceremoniously into a large, overflowing bin filled with other discarded remnants of childhood. Broken toys, faded ribbons, worn shoes. It was a small, seemingly insignificant act, but it was the first cut, severing her from her past. Next came the cleansing ritual. Eliza was led to a cold, tiled room where a large, communal tub of lukewarm water awaited. Her clothes, threadbare but familiar, were stripped from her, replaced by a rough, gray shift. Identical to those worn by the other children she now glimpsed moving through the corridors. Her long, tangled brown hair, which her mother had so lovingly braided, was ruthlessly shorn by a grim-faced attendant. The cold steel of the scissors a shocking contrast to the gentle touch of her mother's comb. The shorn hair falling in clumps to the floor felt like another piece of her identity being swept away. The uniform, coarse and ill-fitting, was deliberately uncomfortable, designed to constantly remind her of her fallen state and her new subordinate place within the workhouse hierarchy. As she stood, shivering and exposed, Eliza caught sight of other children. Their eyes, once bright, were now empty, their movements mechanical, their silence so complete it felt as if death had taken their voices. They moved with a careful precision, avoiding eye contact, their faces devoid of expression. Eliza saw her own future reflected in their hollow gazes, a chilling premonition of the transformation that awaited her. The matron's words, delivered with chilling patience, echoed in the vast, cold space. "You are no longer Eliza. You are now a number. You are a pauper, and you will learn obedience." Life inside the Victorian workhouse was a relentless, soul-crushing cycle of labor, deprivation, and psychological torment, meticulously designed to break the spirit and enforce absolute compliance. For children like Eliza, every waking moment was dictated by the rigid, unforgiving rhythm of the institution. The day began before dawn, with the jarring clang of a bell echoing through the dormitories. Children were roused from their hard, narrow beds, the thin blankets offering little protection against the biting cold that permeated the unheated rooms. There was no time for lingering, no comfort, no gentle awakening. The morning air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the faint, metallic tang of fear. Breakfast was a meager affair, a bowl of watery gruel, sometimes a small piece of stale bread. The food was deliberately bland, barely enough to sustain life, and consumed in silence. Talking was forbidden during meals, a rule enforced by the ever-present watchful eyes of the wardens and matrons. This enforced silence was not merely about order, it was a psychological weapon, isolating each child in their own misery, preventing the formation of bonds that might lead to resistance. After breakfast, the children were marched in single file to their assigned tasks. The days stretched endlessly, filled with monotonous, back-breaking labor that was far beyond the capabilities of their small, malnourished bodies. The work was not productive in a meaningful sense. Its primary purpose was punitive, a form of penance for the sin of poverty. Children in Victorian workhouses were a readily available, exploitable labor force, their small size and vulnerability making them ideal for tasks that adults found difficult or refused. The work was often dangerous, repetitive, and physically devastating. Oakum picking, this was one of the most common and soul-destroying tasks. Children would sit for hours, their tiny fingers tearing apart old tarred ropes, separating the fibers to be used for caulking ships. The tar was harsh, burning their skin and leaving their fingers raw and bleeding. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of tar, irritating their lungs. Eliza spent countless hours hunched over a pile of rope, her back aching, her fingers throbbing, the monotonous tearing a constant reminder of her captivity. The quota was impossible to meet, ensuring that children were always in arrears, always subject to punishment. Stone breaking, for older boys, and sometimes even younger ones. Stone breaking was a common task. Armed with hammers too heavy for their frames, they would spend their days smashing large stones into smaller pieces, destined for road construction. The work was physically brutal, leading to crushed fingers, eye injuries from flying shards, and chronic back pain. The noise was deafening, the dust suffocating. Textile mills? Many workhouses had contracts with local factories, effectively leasing out child labor. Children as young as 7 or 8 would work 12 to 14-hour shifts in deafening, dangerous textile mills. They were often tasked with crawling under machinery to retrieve loose threads, a perilous job that frequently resulted in lost limbs or fatal accidents. The air was hot, humid, and filled with cotton dust, leading to respiratory illnesses. Match factories, another horrific industry that exploited workhouse children, was match production, particularly those using white phosphorus. Children would dip wooden sticks into the chemical, leading to a gruesome condition known as phossy jaw, where their jawbones would rot away, causing excruciating pain, disfigurement, and often death. The workhouse system, in its relentless pursuit of cheap labor, knowingly exposed children to such deadly conditions. Domestic chores. Within the workhouse itself, children were responsible for a vast array of domestic chores, scrubbing floors, washing laundry, emptying chamber pots, tending to the sick and elderly. These tasks were often performed in unsanitary conditions, exposing them to disease and further physical strain. The work was not just physically demanding, it was psychologically crushing. There was no sense of accomplishment, no pride in their labor. It was endless, meaningless toil, designed to instill a sense of worthlessness and absolute dependency. While the poor law mandated some form of education for workhouse children, the reality was often a cruel mockery. Schooling was rudimentary at best, often taught by unqualified or indifferent staff, and constantly interrupted by labor demands. The curriculum was minimal, focusing on basic literacy and numeracy, primarily to enable them to perform their workhouse duties or to be more easily exploited in factories. Eliza's lessons consisted of rote memorization of biblical verses and the alphabet, delivered by a stern elderly woman whose patience was as thin as the gruel. Any sign of inattention or slowness was met with a sharp rap of a ruler or a stint in solitary confinement. The true lesson was not academic, but ideological: obedience, humility, and the acceptance of their fallen status. Critical thinking was actively discouraged, as it might lead to questioning the very system that imprisoned them. Punishment in the workhouse was swift, brutal, and often disproportionate to the offense. It was designed to instill fear and absolute submission, breaking any spirit of defiance. Corporal punishment, beatings with canes, straps, or bare hands, were common for infractions as minor as speaking out of turn, failing to meet a quota, or even crying. The pain was immediate and severe, leaving welts and bruises that served as constant reminders of the consequences of disobedience. Solitary confinement. Children were often locked in dark, unheated cells for hours or even days, deprived of food and water. The isolation was terrifying, particularly for young children, and designed to induce psychological distress and break their will. Starvation and reduced rations. Food was already scarce, but as a punishment, children could have their meager rations further reduced or withheld entirely. The gnawing hunger was a constant companion, making this a particularly effective form of control. Public humiliation. Children might be forced to wear signs detailing their sins, stand in corners for hours, or be subjected to public shaming by staff. This aimed to destroy their self-esteem and reinforce their status as worthless paupers. Psychological torture. Beyond physical punishments, the workhouse employed sophisticated psychological tactics. Children were constantly told they were worthless, a burden, and that their families had abandoned them. Forged letters, supposedly from parents, expressing disappointment and rejection, were sometimes used to destroy any lingering hope of rescue. This systematic gaslighting aimed to rebuild their personalities into compliant, broken servants. Eliza witnessed these punishments daily. She saw children beaten for dropping a piece of oakum, heard the muffled cries from the solitary cells, and felt the gnawing hunger when her own rations were withheld. The kindnesses, when they came, were carefully calculated and strategically distributed, creating an addiction to approval that was more powerful than any physical restraint. A gentle word from a matron, an extra piece of bread, a moment of human warmth. These tiny mercies created desperate hope, making Eliza crave the approval of the very people who were systematically destroying her sense of self. The horrors of the Victorian workhouse system were not random acts of individual cruelty, but the logical outcome of a meticulously designed institutional framework, underpinned by a harsh social philosophy and powerful economic incentives. To understand how such atrocities could flourish, we must examine the systemic forces at play. At its core, the workhouse system was driven by a brutal economic logic. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 aimed to reduce the cost of poor relief by making it as unappealing as possible. The labor of the inmates, including children, was intended to offset the expenses of their upkeep, effectively turning human misery into a source of revenue. Cheap labor, children in particular, represented an incredibly cheap and pliable labor force. They required less food than adults, were easier to control, and could be put to work on tasks that adults might resist. The oakum picking, stone breaking, and factory work performed by children generated income for the parish, reducing the burden on local taxpayers. In some cases, workhouse children were effectively leased out to factories, providing a direct financial incentive for their exploitation. Deterrence. The less eligibility principle was paramount. The conditions inside the workhouse had to be worse than the lowest paid independent laborer outside. This was intended to deter all but the truly desperate from seeking relief, thereby reducing the overall cost of supporting the poor. The suffering of children was an acceptable, even necessary, byproduct of this deterrent strategy. Cost saving for parishes. Local parishes, responsible for funding poor relief, were incentivized to keep costs down. The workhouse, with its communal living and forced labor, was seen as a more efficient, albeit brutal way to manage the poor compared to outdoor relief, handouts. The exploitation of children contributed directly to these cost savings. Beyond economics, the workhouse served as a powerful tool of social control, designed to enforce Victorian moral values and punish those who deviated from them. Poverty was not seen as a societal failing, but as a moral one, a result of idleness, drunkenness, or lack of self-discipline. Punishing poverty, the workhouse was a visible symbol of society's condemnation of poverty. Entering its doors meant public acknowledgement of one's failure, a loss of dignity and social standing. For children, this meant being branded as paupers from a young age, a stigma that would follow them throughout their lives. Moral improvement, the harsh discipline, forced labor, and religious instruction within the workhouse were framed as mechanisms for moral improvement and spiritual rehabilitation. The suffering endured was presented as a necessary penance for their supposed sins of idleness or immorality. This provided a convenient justification for the cruelty, allowing society to believe it was acting for the poor's own good. Preventing pauperism. There was a deep-seated fear that providing too much comfort or aid would encourage pauperism, a state of perpetual dependency on public charity. The workhouse was designed to instill a fear of this state, forcing individuals to strive for self-sufficiency at all costs. Children, as future adults, were indoctrinated into this philosophy from their earliest years. The workhouse system operated with a shocking lack of effective oversight, allowing abuses to flourish largely unchecked. Power of the guardians. Workhouses were managed by boards of guardians, local officials who often had little training or genuine concern for the welfare of the inmates. Their primary motivation was often to keep local rates taxes low, which incentivized harsh conditions and minimal expenditure on the poor. Isolation and secrecy. Workhouses were deliberately isolated from public scrutiny. Their high walls and strict rules prevented outsiders from witnessing the daily realities within. Information about abuses rarely leaked out, and when it did, it was often dismissed as exaggeration or the complaints of undeserving paupers. Public indifference. A significant portion of Victorian society, influenced by prevailing attitudes towards poverty, was largely indifferent to the suffering within the workhouses. The poor were often viewed as a separate, morally inferior class, and their plight was seen as a consequence of their own failings. This widespread apathy created a fertile ground for abuse to thrive. The role of charity. Many workhouses were initially established or supported by charitable organizations, often with religious affiliations. However, the benevolent intentions often became corrupted by the punitive philosophy of the poor law. The facade of Christian charity provided a powerful cover for systematic exploitation, making it difficult for the public to question the institution's true nature. The system had instruction manuals passed down through generations detailing how to break a young woman's spirit while maintaining the appearance of Christian charity. This methodical approach, applied to children, ensured that the systematic demolition of personality was not random, but a calculated process. Eliza's journey within the workhouse was a microcosm of the suffering endured by countless children, a relentless assault on her spirit and body. Her story, interwoven with the fates of others, reveals the profound human cost of this brutal system. As weeks bled into months, Eliza's initial terror gave way to a dull, persistent ache of despair. The gnawing hunger was a constant companion, a hollow emptiness in her stomach that mirrored the growing emptiness in her soul. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and scarred from the oakum, the tar embedded beneath her fingernails a permanent stain. She learned the workhouse rules with chilling efficiency: never speak unless spoken to, never meet the gaze of a warden, never complain, never cry. Crying, she quickly discovered, only brought harsher punishments. She learned to move with the mechanical precision of the other children, her eyes downcast, her shoulders hunched, her spirit retreating deeper within itself. Yet, even in this suffocating environment, small sparks of her former self flickered. She would sometimes steal a moment when no one was watching to trace the patterns on the cold stone wall, imagining them as the intricate designs of her mother's embroidery. She would hoard a tiny crumb of bread, savoring its dry taste, a defiant act of reclaiming a sliver of control. These were not grand rebellions, but desperate, internal acts of preservation, attempts to cling to the last vestiges of her identity. The psychological manipulation was insidious. The matron, Sister Agnes, would occasionally offer a rare, brittle smile, a fleeting moment of kindness that felt like a lifeline. "You are a good girl, Eliza," she might say, her voice surprisingly soft. "God sees your hard work." These tiny mercies were carefully calculated, designed to create an addiction to approval that was more powerful than any physical restraint. Eliza found herself craving these moments, desperate for any sign that she was pleasing them enough to eventually earn release, even as she knew, deep down, that release was a distant, impossible dream. She began to work harder, to pray more fervently, to adopt the submissive posture that marked girls who had learned their place. Without realizing it, she was becoming psychologically dependent on the very people who were systematically destroying her sense of self. Eliza was not alone. The workhouse was a repository of shattered childhoods, each child a testament to the system's cruelty. Thomas, the rebellious spirit, Thomas, a boy a few years older than Eliza, arrived with a fiery spirit that refused to be extinguished. He would whisper jokes during mealtimes, attempt to organize small acts of defiance, and occasionally lash out at the wardens. His rebellions were always met with brutal force, solitary confinement, severe beatings, and public humiliation. Eliza watched him, a mixture of fear and admiration in her heart, as his spirit was slowly, systematically crushed. One day, after a particularly harsh punishment, Thomas simply stopped speaking. His eyes, once defiant, became vacant. His movements slow and deliberate. He had retreated into a protective shell, his mind broken beyond repair. He was eventually transferred to the idiot ward, a euphemism for those whose minds had succumbed to the workhouse's relentless assault. Mary, the fragile soul, Mary, a girl Eliza's age, was frail and sickly upon arrival. She coughed constantly, a hacking sound that echoed in the dormitories at night. She was too weak for the heavy labor, often collapsing during oakum picking. The matron saw her as a burden, a drain on resources. Despite Eliza's attempts to share her meager food, Mary grew thinner and paler with each passing day. One cold winter morning, Eliza found Mary's bed empty. No one spoke of her. Her disappearance was a common occurrence, a silent acknowledgement of the workhouse's grim mortality rate. Her body, like countless others, was likely buried in an unmarked pauper's grave behind the workhouse walls. Her existence erased as completely as if she had never been. William, the success story, William, an older boy, learned to adapt. He became a model inmate, anticipating the warden's desires, working tirelessly and never complaining. He was praised, given slightly larger rations, and eventually apprenticed out to a local factory owner. This was presented as a success story, proof that the workhouse could rehabilitate the poor. But Eliza saw the hollowness in William's eyes, the way he flinched at sudden movements, the mechanical efficiency with which he performed his duties. He had survived, but at the cost of his soul, transformed into a compliant cog in the industrial machine, his capacity for genuine human connection seemingly extinguished. The workhouse system was a silent devourer of children. Mortality rates within these institutions were shockingly high, particularly among infants and young children due to malnutrition, disease, and neglect. Many children simply disappeared from the records, their deaths unacknowledged, their bodies interred in unmarked graves. Beyond death, children also disappeared through other means of exploitation. Some were apprenticed to factories or mines, often under brutal conditions that amounted to little more than child slavery. Others were sent to serve as domestic servants, where they were vulnerable to abuse and often worked long hours for little to no pay. The workhouse, in its relentless pursuit of cost efficiency, became a pipeline for supplying cheap labor to the burgeoning industries of Victorian Britain, effectively selling children into new forms of servitude. Eliza, witnessing these fates, understood with chilling clarity that her own survival depended on her ability to become perfectly compliant. She learned to perform her role, to express gratitude for attention that filled her with terror, and to beg forgiveness for the sin of existing as anything other than an object for others' use. The final horror was not what the workhouse did to its victims, but the discovery of why such institutions were not only tolerated, but actively protected by the highest levels of society. The Victorian workhouse system, with its brutal efficiency and systematic dehumanization of children, eventually faced increasing public scrutiny and reform movements in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Poor Law was gradually dismantled, and the last workhouses officially closed in 1930. However, their legacy and the underlying dynamics that enabled their horrors continue to echo in various forms throughout the modern world. The decline of the workhouse was driven by a combination of factors: changing social attitudes, growing awareness of the abuses within, and the rise of alternative forms of social welfare. Investigative journalism, like that of Charles Dickens, exposed the grim realities, slowly chipping away at public indifference. Yet, the closure of the workhouses did not eradicate the fundamental issues of child exploitation or systemic poverty. It merely forced them into less visible, often more insidious, forms. The workhouse system left an indelible scar on British society, contributing to a deep-seated distrust of state institutions among the working class, and a lingering stigma associated with poverty. The pauper identity, forged in the crucible of the workhouse, continued to haunt generations. The story of Victorian workhouses is not merely ancient history. It represents a pattern of systematic dehumanization that has appeared repeatedly throughout human civilization and continues to manifest in different forms today. Understanding how an entire society convinced itself that such cruelty was not only acceptable, but necessary, provides crucial insights into the dangers that modern societies face. Modern child labor and exploitation. While overt workhouses no longer exist, child labor remains a global crisis. Millions of children worldwide are still exploited in factories, mines, agriculture, and domestic service, often under conditions that mirror the brutality of the Victorian era. The economic incentives remain the same: cheap labor and profit. Systemic poverty and institutional neglect. The underlying logic of punishing poverty, rather than addressing its root causes, persists. Modern welfare systems, while vastly improved, can still inadvertently create conditions of less eligibility or stigmatize those in need. The challenges faced by children in underfunded foster care systems, or those trapped in cycles of intergenerational poverty, bear a chilling resemblance to the systemic neglect of the past. Institutional abuse and lack of oversight. The vulnerability of children within institutional settings remains a persistent concern. Cases of abuse in residential schools, orphanages, and even some modern care facilities highlight how unchecked power, isolation, and a lack of transparency can still lead to horrific outcomes, even in societies that claim to prioritize child welfare. The comments on our previous videos frequently draw parallels to Indigenous children in residential schools in the States and Canada, where children were stripped of their identities, abused, and thousands perished. The normalization of abomination. Perhaps most disturbingly, the Workhouse story reminds us how quickly societies can normalize practices that would have seemed unthinkable to previous generations. The gradual expansion of acceptable reasons for exploiting children, the bureaucratization of the process, and the development of professional classes, whose careers depended on the system's continuation, all offer warnings about how modern institutions might evolve in dangerous directions. The willingness to treat children as commodities, the institutional blindness that allows systematic abuse to continue undetected, and the economic incentives that override moral concerns when profits are substantial enough. These dynamics are timeless. We remember Eliza not as a statistic in workhouse ledgers, but as an 8-year-old girl who deserved protection, love, and the chance to grow into the woman she might have become. Her story survives because someone, somewhere, kept records that revealed the truth. Someone preserved evidence that proved these crimes occurred. Someone refused to let these atrocities disappear into convenient historical amnesia. The story of Victorian workhouses, particularly the horrific experiences of children like Eliza, serves as a stark and enduring warning. It reveals the profound human cost of unchecked power, societal indifference, and the insidious ways in which economic and moral justifications can be twisted to rationalize systematic cruelty. The workhouse was not merely a place of relief, it was a machine designed to consume childhood itself, transforming innocent lives into compliant, broken objects in the service of a harsh ideology. The cold stone walls of these institutions may have crumbled, and the poor law may be a relic of the past, but the echoes of the children's suffering resonate through time. Their silent voices from the depths of the workhouse whisper a simple but profound truth: every life has inherent value, and any society that forgets this lesson risks losing its soul. Today, as we grapple with our own challenges of poverty, child welfare, and institutional accountability, the ghosts of those Victorian children remind us that the price of progress is often humanity itself. We remember their pain not to sensationalize it, but to honor their humanity and ensure that the systems which enabled their victimization are recognized and resisted whenever they emerge. The girl who dreamed of a warm loaf of bread and chasing pigeons deserved better. Her story, and the stories of hundreds of thousands like her, demand that we never again allow beautiful words and charitable facades to hide such systematic destruction of vulnerable young lives. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard. And there are so many more stories waiting to be told.